Did Frank, did he try to meet her halfway at all?
Well, the source says he did make some attempts at reconciliation. He was apparently willing to stop talking to other family members who are anti-maskers. He even agreed to wear a mask himself when around her, despite, his age maybe making him feel differently about it.
Okay, so he did offer some compromise.
He did. But the bottom line was, he still voted. And Raven's preconditions, like demanding he not vote at all, are described by the source as just insane, especially given, voting is a fundamental right.
Yeah, demanding someone give up their right to vote is a lot.
It is. And let's look at that mask issue for a second. Raven says she wears it because I care, to prevent illness. But the source pushes back, saying, well, she doesn't have a job, apparently few friends, so her exposure is likely low. And at 24, she's in a very low-risk group compared to, say, Frank at 82.
Right. He's actually the high-risk one there.
Exactly. The analysis suggests the mask might be less about health and maybe more about control or perhaps a symbol. It's also mentioned she got angry at Frank just for coughing, even though he's the one in the vulnerable age.
That power dynamic. And this brings us back to her idea of unconditional love. How does the source interpret that?
This is a really crucial point. The source interprets Raven's implied definition as basically meaning, you will love me even if I abuse you. And it explicitly labels this a red flag, saying it's a definition often used by abusers to excuse their behavior.
Oof, heavy.
It is. And the insight isn't just about Raven, right? It's about learning to recognize when unconditional love is maybe being twisted to mean love without any accountability for my actions.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. So does the source give any more background on Raven's life, her family?
It does provide some context, trying to understand maybe where some of this comes from, and mentions a reportedly difficult background. A mother addicted to drugs, an absent father, an alcoholic grandmother. And Raven herself has talked about starting hard drugs when she was 17, though she says she currently only uses weed.
Okay, so a tough upbringing, clearly.
Very much so. And what's really interesting and kind of contradictory is how she talks about Frank now versus before. Now she calls him an enabler. But the source points out that in the past, she apparently called him her safe haven, the place she could go to get away from her abusive parent.
Wow, that's a big shift from safe haven to enabler.
Huge shift. And it makes you wonder, what changed in her perception or her narrative.
So how does the source address the enabler?
Well, it offers some perspective. It explains that in families struggling with addiction, the dynamic of enabling is really common, and often the enabler feels trapped too. Plus, older generations, like Frank's, just didn't have the same access to mental health information and understanding of addiction that we have.
That's fair. The context matter.
Absolutely. And crucially, the source mentions that Frank has apparently apologized for any past enabling behavior he now recognizes, and he's trying to make amends. So he's showing some self-awareness and willingness to change, which doesn't seem to be acknowledged by Raven.
And this dynamic, the source suggests, involves some emotional manipulation.
Yes, quite significantly. It suggests Raven uses her grandfather's age and his obvious love for her as leverage, as a way to assert power. It mentions her history of cutting off her own mother, and this really chilling quote attributed to her, "I cannot wait for all of my abusers to pass away."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And the source points out a real lack of self-awareness. She complains about feeling alone, but she's actively pushing people away. She even reportedly mocked Frank for having no friends shortly after his wife, her grandmother, had died.
Incredibly harsh.
It highlights this pattern of, seemingly destructive behavior that she doesn't appear to recognize in herself.
The source mentioned a meltdown.
Yes, a 7-hour meltdown in a bathroom. The source kind of poses the question, could this indicate a relapse into hard drugs? We don't know, obviously. But it connects this to the idea of addiction recovery, noting that genuine recovery usually involves learning forgiveness, forgiving others, forgiving yourself. And forgiveness seems to be something Raven really struggles with.
It sounds like it.
This suggests maybe there are deeper struggles going on, beyond just the political disagreements.
And despite all this, Frank was still helping her financially.
Apparently so. The source mentions an instance where he covered a $400 car repair bill for Raven and her partner, which just underscores this very one-sided dynamic, right?
Yeah.
His support is accepted, even expected, but his own feelings, his boundaries, his political views are completely dismissed or...
Okay, so stepping back from the specifics of Raven and Frank, what are the broader lessons or principles the source draws from this case?
Yeah, it connects this specific, intense situation to some bigger ideas. First, about political progress. It reminds us that, realistically, politics is usually about gradual improvement, not achieving some perfect utopia overnight.
Right. managing expectations.
Exactly. And it brings in insights from political science, like from the book The Dictator's Handbook, suggesting that often politicians' main goal is just to stay in power while enriching themselves and their friends. It's not always about pure ideology.
A rather cynical view, but perhaps realistic sometimes.
Perhaps. And it argues the American system, with things like the Bill of Rights, the checks and balances, was actually designed because the founders understood this human tendency for power to be grabbed by liars, cheaters, and thieves. The system is meant to make tyranny difficult, even with flawed leaders.
So demanding ideological purity from, say, your grandpa's vote misunderstands how the system is even supposed to work.
That seems to be the implication. And tied to that, the source stresses that if you actually want to educate someone or change their mind, it takes care, patience, and kindness, not, as we see in this case, belittlement, shame, and guilt. That just shuts people down.
That makes So moving towards practical takeaways, the source mentions specific behavioral patterns. It even brings up a specific diagnosis.
It does, and this is a sensitive area, so it's important to be clear the source is suggesting this, not making a clinical diagnosis. It observes that Raven exhibits a number of traits that are consistent with borderline personality disorder, or BP.
Okay, and what are those traits according to the source's observation?
Things like the intense emotional outbursts, screaming, crying, passive aggression, the demanding of unconditional love while potentially being abusive, claiming victimhood while still having agency, a significant lack of self-awareness about her own impact on others, and using emotional blackmail.
A lot. And BPD, for listeners who might not know, is a really serious mental health condition characterized by instability in moods, relationships, self-image, and behavior.
Exact, complex. And the source then offers some practical advice, drawing from a well-known book called Stop Walking on Eggshells, which is aimed at people who have someone with BPD in their lives.
Okay, what kind of advice?
It emphasizes things like setting very clear boundaries, allowing the person with the challenging behaviors to actually face the natural consequences of their actions rather than constantly shielding them.
Not enabling, essentially.
Right. And crucially, recognizing your own limits. You are not qualified to treat or fix a person with BPD. That requires professional help. The priority has to be taking care of your own mental and emotional health first.
That sounds vital.
And for someone really deeply involved, like Frank seems to be, the advice gets even tougher. It might require a willingness to actually step back, maybe even leave, and critically, being willing to let the person with BPD suffer the consequences of their bad decisions.
Wow, that's incredibly difficult advice for a family member.
Incredibly difficult. But the point is that sometimes protecting yourself means allowing the other person to hit their own rock bottom, which might be the only way they seek real help. It's not about abandoning them out of malice, but about self-preservation and breaking dysfunctional.
This whole deep dive, it really lays bare how tangled family dynamics can get with politics, with personal history, with mental health struggles. It really makes you think about the importance of, well, critical thinking, not just about news or politics, but about the relationships right in front of us.
Absolutely. And this case study, it pushes us to think about some really tough questions, doesn't it? In this world that feels increasingly polarized, where our identity is so often tied up with our politics, how do we handle these relationships? How do we set boundaries to protect ourselves without just cutting everyone off or without enabling behavior that's genuinely harmful, especially when it's someone we deeply care about, like a grandparent or a grandchild? What does real unconditional love look like in these messy, charged situations? When does love need to include tough boundaries, maybe even distance, for everyone's well?
Really powerful question. Ones with no easy answers, I suspect. Hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listeners, some new things to consider, some fresh angles on a really complex issue that honestly affects so many of us.